Hey there, 8th grade historians, and welcome. Today, we're diving into a brand new explainer where we are going to uncover exactly how early English colonies developed their own completely unique identities. We'll look at the roots of self-government and religion, but just as importantly, we're going to critically examine the historical realities of who was actually included and who was systematically excluded from these early systems of power. Here's our quick roadmap for today's explainer. We're going to contrast two very different colonial paths, explore their early communities, analyze the strict limits on participation, evaluate a historical claim, and then wrap things up with a recap and a final transfer question. All right, let's jump right into Section 1, Two Diverging Colonial Paths. So why did people actually risk their lives to cross the Atlantic back in the 1600s? Well, the answer depends entirely on where they landed. The Chesapeake colonies, like Jamestown in Virginia, were completely commercially driven. They were settled largely by thousands of unmarried, unemployed young Englishmen who were frankly looking to get rich. And when gold didn't pan out, they pivoted to a booming tobacco economy run by the Virginia Company. But if we look up north, New England was a totally different story. It was settled mainly by pious Puritan families who wanted to practice their Reformed Protestantism away from the Church of England. They weren't after a quick payout at all. They were envisioning a model society, what their leader John Winthrop called a city upon a hill, or a new English Israel. Okay, I want you to pause this explainer right here and really test your knowledge. Based on what we just covered, what was the primary difference in motivation between the settlers down in the Chesapeake versus those up in New England? Take a few seconds and lock in your answer. All right, and here is the immediate reasoning. Basically, it boils down to this. Chesapeake settlers were essentially employees of a joint stock company looking for a solid return on investment, which they eventually found by growing tobacco. New Englanders, on the other hand, were building permanent family-based communities focused on their congregational churches so they could escape religious persecution in England.
Moving on to Section 2, Covenants and Religious Communities.
Now, let's see how those differing motivations built entirely different forms of colonial government. In 1620, before even stepping off their ship, a group of Puritan separatists, who you probably know as the Pilgrims, signed the Mayflower Compact. Notice the specific language they use here. They chose to covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic. So rather than relying on a company charter or having a monarch rule them directly, they essentially created a religious and civil contract to work together for the general good of their brand new colony. This document is widely viewed as one of the absolute first frameworks for self-government in North America.
If we break it down, we can really see how power was distributed across three distinct regions. Down in the Chesapeake, because the whole motive was commercial profit, power naturally fell into the hands of wealthy investors and planters who formed early commercial assemblies. Up in New England, power was tightly rooted in religious covenants and the congregational churches. But then we have this third region, the Middle Colonies, specifically Pennsylvania. Founded a bit later by William Penn, this colony was heavily shaped by the Quakers. They believed absolutely everyone had an inner light. This led them to establish communities that rejected worldly rank in favor of radical social equality. They treated everyone as equals.
Let's move to Section 3, Limits on Colonial Participation.
While these early forms of self-government were definitely groundbreaking, as historians, we have to impartially report on the harsh realities regarding who was completely left out of these systems. The crucial takeaway here is that early colonial identity was heavily exclusive. As English settlements expanded, powerful native empires, like the Powhatan in the Chesapeake and the Wampanoag in New England, faced aggressive expansion that led to devastating warfare and disease. Enslaved Africans were forced into grueling labor with literally zero legal rights. Women, who were heavily restricted by patriarchal societies, lacked any political voice. And even in colonies founded specifically for religion, those who thought differently were pushed out. Let's look at some primary sources to see exactly how this worked in practice.
We have to look objectively at the historical text. Robert Beverly, a wealthy Jamestown planter writing in 1705, explicitly detailed how chattel slavery was legally codified in Virginia. By making a law that said status follows the womb, planters ensured that the children of enslaved women were legally born into permanent, lifelong slavery. This created a permanent, generational underclass that was entirely stripped of all participation in the so-called self-government of the colony.
And the exclusion didn't stop there. Even in super tight-knit religious communities like Massachusetts Bay, participation had strict limits. Literate women like Anne Hutchinson presented a massive challenge to the male minister's authority. She actively criticized the religious teachings of the colony and claimed she had direct religious revelation, meaning God spoke directly to her, no minister needed. For this defiance of their religious and political structure, the Puritan authorities excommunicated and entirely banished her in 1638.
All right, time for our second pause check. Take a moment and pause the explainer to answer this. Why were dissenters, like Anne Hutchinson and others like Roger Williams, banished from a colony that was explicitly founded on religious motives?
So here is the immediate reasoning. While it is true the Puritans fled persecution in England to find a place to worship freely, they were completely intolerant of any views that undermined their own religious and political authority. They viewed dissenters like Hutchinson and Williams basically as national security threats who challenged the male hierarchy and the unity of their brand new society. Put simply, the Puritans wanted religious freedom for themselves, but definitely not for opposing views.
Moving right along to Section 4, Evaluating a Historical Claim.
Let's put your historical thinking skills to work. We are going to evaluate a specific claim using the evidence we've just uncovered throughout this explainer. Here is the claim. English colonies were founded on the principle of equal self-government for all. As a student of history, your job is to look at this statement and determine if it holds up against the primary sources and facts of the era.
Using the claim evidence reasoning model, you have to weigh the evidence on both sides. On one hand, you have incredible milestones. You've got the Mayflower Compact creating a civil body politic and planters forming early assemblies in Virginia. That is real, documented evidence of self-government. But you absolutely must weigh that against the objective historical evidence of severe exclusion. We're talking about the brutal codification of chattel slavery based on race, massive conflicts over land like King Philip's War against Native Americans, and the harsh banishment of religious dissenters. You have to synthesize both of these realities, the democratic foundations and the systematic exclusion, to truly understand early America. It's like a giant, complex puzzle.
And finally, Section 5, Recap and Transfer. We have covered a ton of ground today, analyzing dense primary texts and looking at differing colonial motivations. Let's quickly summarize the key takeaways before you apply this to the broader scope of U.S. history. To recap concisely, the colonies developed unique identities based on their founding goals. You had commercial profit via tobacco in the Chesapeake, contrasting with religious ideals in New England and Pennsylvania. These differing motives led to new governing structures, like commercial assemblies and religious covenants. But as we've clearly seen, these frameworks laid early democratic foundations while simultaneously excluding major populations, including Native Americans, enslaved Africans, women, and dissenters.
Let's see how this all builds into the future of the nation. I'm going to leave you with this final provocative thought to discuss in class or just ponder on your own. Considering the strict, harsh limits on participation we learned about today, who is actually allowed to govern and who is treated as property or banished, how do you contrast those realities with the ideals later written in 1776 in the Declaration of Independence, which boldly claimed that all men are created equal? Keep that tension in mind as you continue your journey through U.S. history. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.